Welcome to Ask John. I think this is the 20th episode of Ask John. We've done so many of these, I've lost count. This show was conceived with the idea that we would have people coming on the show to ask John. I'm John Reuscher, and to ask me financial questions. But it quickly turned into some kind of a different Ask John, where John was asking the questions. And we've been getting really interesting guests. A few weeks ago, I interviewed a man by the name of Andrew Gunther, who was a climate change scientist, who is a climate change scientist. And we asked some hard questions of him, and then he held up under the hard questioning. And today I have a man named Jim Steele that we're going to talk to. And Jim is an environmentalist and an ecologist. He was the director of the San Francisco State University Sierra Nevada field campus for 25 years. He studied regional climate change and the effect on wildlife, and primarily on birds, and restoration of wetlands. Jim wrote a book called Landscapes and Cycles, an Environmentalist's Journey to Climate Skepticism. And so that makes Jim a climate skepticist. Is that right? You're skeptic.
Sure, absolutely.
You're a climate skeptic.
Absolutely.
Okay. And you're not afraid to admit it.
Oh no, I'm proud.
Okay, well,
it's good scientific thinkers have to be skeptical.
I understand that. Jim, we talked a little bit about trying to categorize, and I know you don't like the idea of category. There's so many possible categories of people and how they think about climate change, and sometimes I think of the deniers and the skeptics, and sometimes the alarmists, and the advocates. And when I call someone a climate advocate, it's almost like saying, oh wait, well, they're advocating climate change. No, that's not really what they are, but they're an advocate of this idea that climate change is real and identified and very specific and a real threat to our environment. So I know you don't like to fit into those categories, but if you do, then you clearly are on the skeptic side. Oh, you said, did you say there's the lukewarmers too?
There's lukewarmers. There's people all over the board on this. So it's more political theater to try to label people, often to denigrate their position more than anything else. So I like to try to avoid those labels.
It's political theater.
So let's try to talk the evidence and see what we come up with.
Yeah. So why politics get involved in this?
Well, it's hard to say for different reasons, but I think at stake for a lot of people is how you control energy policy. I think some people just have strong egos that they want to win an argument. There's a number of different things. There's a lot of strange bedfellows when you have politics. So
and in politics we seem to on any particular topic we seem to take sides immediately. Anything that happens, one side takes a position, and so obviously that's the wrong position for the other side.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So it's too bad that.
Unfortunately,
it's too bad for science to get involved in that. That's not a good thing.
And hopefully that's partly what I've been trying to do is talk about it and write about it from a scientific point of view, and let people see some of the evidence that doesn't necessarily get pushed in the media, to make them think about this a little more.
Okay. So you belong to an organization. What's the organization that you belong to?
Well, I was recently recruited to a group called the CO2 Coalition. And it's
the
CO2 Coalition,
okay.
CO2 for carbon dioxide. It's a number of scientists who are skeptic, and it's a loose coalition of a number of different scientists. So Harrison Schmitt, the last astronaut to walk on the moon, is part of that. Roy Spencer, who does a lot of the satellite data looking at how the atmosphere is changing as CO2 rises, he's part of that. We have Richard Lindzen, who is the MIT atmospheric scientist. Patrick Moore, who is one of the founders of Greenpeace, is part of it. So it was a number of people who are definitely into understanding how the climate's changing. They have a more skeptical view. And it's nice to be around people who I can talk with about the science, and not just, sometimes you go on the internet and it's just name calling. So when they asked me to join, I was glad to do it. It's a number of good people.
So I can hear the climate advocates or the climate alarmists saying, how can you do this? Do you know what kind of horrible situation we're going to have? And if we don't take it seriously, Jim, it's going to be your responsibility. So what do you say?
And I have people say that because I'm skeptical, I'm going to cause humanity to go extinct. And personally, I think that's ridiculous. Partly what I want to try to show you today is the data doesn't support these catastrophic views. It might get worse in the future, but it's not as bad as it's being pushed right now. So, and hopefully I can provide some data to make people relax a little bit and think about what's going on.
Is there some possible harm in the solutions to what you would consider hypothetical climate change or alarming climate change? Is there harm in some of the solutions?
If you have a bad analysis, you're going to have a bad remedy, very simply. And partly what got me into being a skeptic is I was monitoring a meadow for the birds in the Sierra Nevada, and it was pretty much a complete crash. It was drying out, the willows were dying. And a lot of people said, oh, that's climate change, and so we got to stop pumping CO2. Well, it turned out that it had nothing to do with climate change, it was bad hydrology. And as I investigated further, we fixed the way the streams move, the way the subsurface flow. It brought back the willows, it brought back the birds, and it's better now than it ever has. It stayed wetter during our 3 or 4 year drought in California due to the restoration than it had been before the drought. So there's, and partly what prompted me to want to write this book and push this is if people just cavalierly blame CO2 for everything, you're going to miss the remedies that we could actually do the right thing to make the environment more resilient.
And it seems like in our discussions that there are a lot of different problems, and there's a lot of different issues that all require maybe some different solutions.
Well,
so that if we have this cookie cutter approach of reducing CO2, that may help something, but it may not cure all of the problems.
Right, and for example, I've given you is that there's a big push now saying all these extinctions are going on. And most of your extinctions are happening on islands. And the cause of that has been, we introduced alien species there 100, 200 years ago. Hawaii is a hot spot for extinctions, and partly sailors in the 1800s in their water barrels brought mosquitoes. The mosquitoes transmitted avian malaria, and so you had a tremendous die-off of a lot of the native birds in Hawaii. It has nothing to do with climate, but right now I see a lot of people pushing all these extinctions are due to climate change. If you try to cut down on CO2, it's not going to stop the problem with all these aliens, invaders on these islands. So if you want to do the right thing to stop extinctions, start working with different groups that are trying to eradicate introduced species onto these islands.
I remember asking Andrew this, is CO2 all bad?
No,
I knew you were going to say that.
It's all your plants require CO2, whether they're algae in the oceans or it's your trees. And all those photosynthesizing organisms evolved when CO2 was 6,000, 7,000 parts per million. And
6,000
yeah,
parts
so
per million.
and we're at 400 parts per million
Okay.
now. So these plants are actually starving for CO2, and so what all your commercial...
Which plant? All plants? They want
all
more?
plants are not getting enough CO2.
None of them are getting enough CO2?
Well, they find ways to work around it, but what your commercial greenhouses will do is they'll pump in 1,000 extra parts per million to make their plants grow better. Now, some plants have designed ways, different kinds of photosynthesis or different CO2 concentration mechanisms within all of your plankton. So there's ways they try to overcome that kind of starvation. But they're in an environment now that is much different from what they evolved in. And what they evolved in was something with high concentrations of CO2.
So that's really hard to. So if we're really successful in reducing our CO2 levels, then we're harming the planet in another way.
Well, yeah, some of the benefits won't be there. And there's some papers out there recently, and one person, Dr. Idso, who's again part of the coalition, he's done a lot of work on the CO2 fertilization effect. and the greening of the globe, and NASA even had something on their website about a greening of the globe that they'll, at least in part, accredit to more CO2.
So you're not a denier. You accept that the CO2 levels are rising.
Oh, absolutely. That's
okay.
and see, I think when you try to put people in category, there's a problem. A lot of people don't understand what the real issues are.
Yeah.
And partly what I'm going to try to push here is what we all agree on, whether you're on the skeptic side or the alarmist side or a lukewarmer or any place in between, is we all agree CO2 is a greenhouse effect. It's a greenhouse gas. We all agree that CO2 is higher than it was 200 years ago. And we'll all agree that climate has been changing since the Little Ice Age. And that's about where the consensus stops. And even within the people that would call themselves advocates of CO2
the climate
warming.
has been changing since the Little Ice Age.
Since the Little Ice Age.
But does that mean, but I didn't hear you say that it's getting warmer since the...
Well, it has been getting warmer,
Okay.
but it's also been oscillating.
Okay.
And so part of the issues is there is no consensus within the scientific community on how sensitive the Earth is.
There's no
to
consensus, but you hear it all the time.
Well, that's what I'm saying. There's
97%. So
what I gave you
so what
as
is that
a consensus.
97%? What is that 97%?
Well, it depends on what kind of survey they do. And I'll show you a graph that shows you what kind of consensus there is. But there's no consensus on how sensitive the Earth is to CO2. And that's the main issue, because you can have feedbacks where if you cause more warming, you cause more clouds, you cause less solar heating, you might just counteract any kind of heating CO2 will cause. There's heat in the oceans that have been stored there for 1,000 years that could be coming out. There are many different aspects to why the climate is changing. So that, and I'll show you a graph quickly on this. The other thing is, how do you separate natural climate change from anthropogenic or human-caused climate change that we're going to blame on CO2? And the third thing is, how catastrophic is it? Is it always going to cause all these deaths that some people are pushing? Well, this picture that I'm trying to show here, all these people, these are all the models of different scientists on how sensitive they think the climate is to, if you double CO2, how much will the temperature change?
So is this it's not a consensus, obviously, because it's a pretty big spread, but this is all of the scientists?
Well, so this is
these
are all the top models here, and
Yeah.
so there's a number of scientists working with different institutions using different models. And so you see a spread between 1 and 5 degrees. So there's clearly no consensus in terms of how sensitive it is. And these surveys don't look at this. This is looking at what the scientists are actually modeling and predicting. And if you look at this model too, what you see is the lowercase with the squares and the circles, that's observation from satellites and from weather balloons. And all that data shows that the Earth its atmosphere hasn't warmed as much as these models.
Those lines, there's a whole bunch of lines that are going all over the place, but mostly they're going up. And those are the predictions.
That's the predictions.
And the bottom line, the bars, are the little what are we calling those? The bottom, the blue dots. That's the actual.
That's the actual observations. And so the models are running a little hot.
The models are running hot.
Right. They're hotter than what we're seeing.
I heard you say that. That
Yeah.
sounds. Yeah. So the models are running hot. That means that the models are predicting something that's
somehow
not happening actually.
they're not giving enough credit to maybe natural change, or
Well,
they're giving CO2 too much credit.
Yeah.
And it'll take a few years before we can actually finalize or get a better picture of this.
I've always wondered whether what is it that we don't know, that nature is amazing and its restorative properties. So what do we don't know that can come in that we didn't anticipate that would fix the problem?
Well, I'm going to just shoot through this.
You can't tell me what we don't know.
This is sort of the crisis graph that and that's what everyone says. You have more. They see this straight increase in temperatures, global temperatures, and they're saying it's due to CO2, most of it. Now, a lot of these models were conceived in the 80s and the 90s. They're constantly being tuned for different reasons. But some things like these multi-decadal oscillations, it's like an El Nino that would happen for 30 years or more La Niñas for another 30 years, called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. And that was just identified in 1997. And the people in this graph, Johnstone and Mantua, they're the ones that discovered that. It's now part of every climate scientist's vocabulary because they know it has a tremendous effect on everything. And they published a paper in 2015 showing that the way these oscillations work is they shift the surface temperatures a little colder than normal one place, a little warmer another, and that causes the air circulation to change in different ways. And if it brings more warm air into the United States, we have warmer temperatures. Not because it was a warming from CO2, but because the transport of heat changed. And their paper showed that you could explain all the warming along in the Northeast Pacific. It was like from Alaska down to the United States West Coast. You could explain it all completely by this oscillation. You don't need to use CO2. So a lot of these oscillations we're just starting to understand now. They're just, in the last 10 years, they've become a bigger part of the scientific literature, but we don't understand how they're going to work because we need, so every 60 years they might switch. So you really need 100 or so years before you can identify how much they're affecting the climate versus how much CO2. So there's a lot of work still to be done.
And that's the nature of science.
That's the nature. That's when they say there's no more debate. It's really, again, that's a way to kind of push your policies through before we really know what's going on.
Yeah, I'm always, what makes me personally a skeptic is not knowledge. You know, I don't have knowledge, but I'm skeptical. I feel skeptical when someone says it's settled science. I think those two words never go together. Science is never settled. You always keep studying. What I appreciated about Andrew Gunther and my conversation with him is that he was very appreciative of just having the conversation. That is something that we don't have a discussion about. We have very little discussion about it, and I think that's a wonderful thing. I doubly appreciate you being here because I don't think you get. I don't think the skeptical side of this whole thing gets presented very much.
It certainly doesn't, and I hope maybe me and Dr. Gunther could sit down and have a little debate.
I would love that.
That would help enlighten everybody.
Yeah.
And in this slide, I'm just trying, but I feel like there's a push by some scientists and a lot of the public to say, well, the 97%. And it's really a push to say, if we want more groupthink. And it's just the antithesis of what science should be. It should be, I should challenge, I should think critically. And groupthink is just the opposite of what you want. And educators in school would say, don't get bullied by peer pressure, be your own person, think for yourself. Except for when it comes to climate. They say if you think for yourself, all of a sudden now you're called a denier, now you're called evil, now you're causing the end of the world, and you try to get pressured into say it. And this term, the 97%, has been this kind of political theater to push that kind of groupthink. And all these good scientists that are a little skeptical, oh, they're just marginal, they're just fringe. So there's this problem. And the media has been very complicit in this. And I'll give you one example here. There's a group, an organization of journalists in different media called Climate Desk. And they all have got together to say, we need to push this message of the dangers of climate change. And so here's a list of all the groups here. You have like the Huffington Post, Grist, a number of groups here that are probably have a large majority of the media presence, and they all push about the same story. And if you probably remember 3 years ago, we didn't have a climate crisis. We just had climate change. And that didn't get enough political reaction. So and this was just this year, The Guardian, who's part of this group, told all its journalists, don't use the word climate change, use the word climate crisis or climate emergency. So the last few years, that's all we're hearing now is this climate crisis, climate emergency. And I think it's a horrible thing that they're doing to the public. They're creating an anxiety that is not really needed. And
so we're recording this in August of 2019, and there's some fires going on in the Amazon, and we're hearing that word crisis. And so tell me what your perspective is about that.
I can't tell you a whole lot about it because it's just come up now. But in the tropics, there's been slash and burn agriculture for forever that we know about, at least historically. And you clear the land and you clear the stubble by using fires. We've done that in the rice fields here in California. They do it in the Great Plains. It's the easiest way to kind of release the nutrients back into the ground, and it's the easiest way to kind of clear the land. The Amazon fires start in July and August every year, and they're always started by humans to clear the land. There's hardly, in the rainforest, you don't usually get fires. It's just too wet. How much of those farms are backing into a rainforest and causing it to burn down? We don't know that data yet. And people say, well, if it's warmer, it's drier, it's going to cause the rainforest to burn more easily. But it was one of the wetter summers they've had. They had floods there, so that argument doesn't really hold. There were a number of things going by on Twitter where, like President of France, Macron, he was saying this, he was showing pictures of these infernos, but they were pictures taken 20 years ago. So there's some kind of every time there's a crisis, something that happens, people try to turn it into a climate crisis that it shouldn't be.
Or maybe it is, but the point being, is it worse? This is being presented as the worst fire. At least that's what I'm hearing. And so is that? Do you think?
Well, Sam, that's what I'm saying. Different groups like this will tell you everything's the worst.
Have we had worse fires?
2004, 2005, you probably had 4 times as many fires.
Oh.
And
I mean, in the Amazon.
And the Amazon in Brazil. And people try to say, well, it's the right winger now. Well, it was a left winger back then. And so the politics again get into it. President Lula of Brazil was the Workers' Party, very left wing. They changed after a while, but they destroyed a lot of the rainforest on their own in the early 2000s. And now there's been a slight creeping up of fires since about 2012. But this new guy and he's only been in for 6 months, but everyone's trying to hang it on him because he's right wing. So again, I try to put aside all those kind of politics. People are just going to try to demean whoever's not on their side. And you got to start looking at the evidence. NASA came out and said, August 13th, they put something on their website saying the fires right now were no worse than average. So there's, how much people are trying to hype it and make a crisis. Different people have different reasons.
Yeah.
And I can't explain all those, but I feel the hype is a tremendous disservice.
Yeah. Well, certainly it's not a good thing.
It's certainly not.
Okay. All right. Okay. Yeah. So if I'm going to take their point of view, then I might say, well, look, maybe we know this is not like the worst thing, but it's really, really bad, and we're not getting enough attention. We haven't gotten enough attention for this for a long, long time, and so it's time that this gets the attention it needs. So we hype it. Maybe we hype it too much, but it's important. It's a real problem.
Well, just make the problem again. A bad analysis cause bad remedies, and I personally think because people have pushed this climate crisis, there's been a push for biofuels, where you have people taking away lands that were once used for crops, and now you grow sugarcane or corn for biofuels, soybean for biodiesel, and now those crops have to go someplace else, or now the pastures have to go someplace else. So in a lot of places in Brazil, biofuels have sort of usurped the land use for this climate crisis and force people closer to the rainforest in order to try to grow the crops and feed themselves. So in some ways, by having this bad remedy of a climate crisis, for a climate crisis with biofuels, they're making things worse. And if you got rid of some of those biofuels and just grew your crops and your pastures where they used to be, we probably wouldn't be touching the rainforest.
So you spent a lot of time in the Sierras, so
yes.
you have some knowledge of what goes on in terms of the forest and how the forest is managed. And we talked a little bit about what PG&E needed to do in order to clean up where their power lines are going. But there's also maybe some better remedies to reduce the number of fires, whether it's caused by climate change or not caused by climate change. We are having more fires, and the fires or maybe we're not having more fires, but the fires are certainly a lot hotter and more widespread once they start. And so there's some things that we can do to,
sure.
Yeah.
And I just I'm not going according to my own script, but according to your questions. So okay. Here's a paper by a fire ecologist, and everything in blue here is natural fires. And these natural fires are started by lightning. Everything in red...
By lightning. Okay.
By lightning.
Okay.
Everything in red is by human ignitions.
Okay.
And the human ignitions could be, say they had in the fire in Reading, you had an accident, the trailer sparked and set these grasses on fire, and that spread to a forest inferno. You had PG&E not securing the grid like it should have, sparking fires. You have arsonists. Some people say maybe up to 30% of the fires are arson. But if you look at this graph, it's not during the warm, driest period. It's like February, March, April. There's this peak in fires because it's when people have been setting these fires off for whatever different reasons. So you hear some people say, oh, I have a climate crisis, the world is burning. Well, the world is burning if the right analysis was, let's secure our power grid. And there was a bipartisan bill pushing Governor Brown to do that, and he vetoed it. He saw it was too expensive, I think, and he kept pushing climate change instead. If he had secured the power grid in a better way, some of these fires that happen in Santa Rosa, up at Paradise, might never have happened. So again, you have the wrong remedy, you can have the wrong analysis, you get the wrong remedy. And people have this knee-jerk reaction to any time there's some horrible thing, let's blame it on climate change. In a way, it's a political just covering their butt for making bad decisions. So again, the fires here in the western part of the United States are more because humans have started it. How bad the fires are is because we've mismanaged the fuel loads. We've allowed, as people move in, you don't want to have fires anymore. So you suppress the fires. There used to be a policy, if we see a fire, this Forest Service policy, that we got to put it out by 10 a.m. the next day. And they never let natural fires happen. And ecologists, we knew that this is a problem because fire is a natural part of our ecology. And in Sequoia, if you don't have fires, the sequoias can't sprout.
We had Michael Landrum on the show a few months ago, and Michael is a silviculturist. So he's silviculturist, obviously, is someone, well, not obvious to most of us, but you certainly know. He was an expert on forest management, and he gave me this stat that's unbelievable, that what falls on the ground, detritus, whatever,
detritus,
detritus, okay. The leaves and all that stuff, it stacks up 1 ton per acre per year. Mm-hmm. And if there's just a year or so of it there and it burns, it's going to be a small fire and it'll burn out.
Yeah.
If there's 10 years of that and 10 tons of it, that's a hot, that's packed. And that's a hot fire that goes to the tops of the trees.
Sure.
And then it takes off.
And to make it, to push it, a lot of times it's fire weather.
So you know what, Jim?
Okay.
I don't care whether climate change has an impact on that or not. I really don't care. What I wanted to do is I wanted to fix that problem.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And partly what I want to say is that fire managers, when they put out red flag warnings, is because they know it's going to be hot and dry, and certain vegetation is going to catch fire easy. And they have what they break it down into a 1-hour fire fuel. That means if you have a dry, warm conditions for just 1 hour, then you can start a fire. And grasses and some of that duff on the ground are these 1 hours. They have some that are 10 hours, which are twigs. So it's in one day. You don't have to have 20 years of climate change. You just have to have 1 day of dry conditions with this kind of fuel on the ground.
In the wind.
And the wind picks up. That's the other part of the red flag warnings.
Yeah.
Then you can have these tremendous fires. And so again, it's monitoring those kind of conditions.
Would you advocate clearing good portions, I mean small portions of the forest as a fire break?
Make fire breaks. I think some places you have to worry. There's been a lot of invasive grasses, cheatgrass, and Reno, they have a tremendous problem with it. It's been taking over in a lot of places, and it's been pulling fires into the deserts that never had fires before. It's sort of like the fuse that brings the fire into the forest and allows it to burn even worse. If you're going to start a campfire, You don't put a match under a log, no matter how dry it is. You have to start with kindling. And so a lot of things on the ground, this grass or this stuff, the detritus.
Lots of kindling there.
That's lots of kindling, and that's what has to be managed. So
how do you clear that?
Well, that's a problem, and as we realize that's an issue, there's a number of groups trying to do native plants, but that takes a lot of work. There's places that mechanically you try to clean things up. The prescribed burns is probably the easiest way to do it, where you light a fire and you clean the duff up, but you do it under controlled conditions. That's politically problematic because a lot of people don't like the smoke. I know when the Paradise was burning, I had just got over a cold in my lungs, and my lungs were burning from the smoke coming from the Paradise fire down into Pacifica, California. And the particles and whatever. So there's a lot of people that don't like prescribed burns, even though that would probably be the easiest and best solutions. Fire ecologists are working in Yosemite, so let's do mechanical thinning instead of burning, so we don't allow that kind of fuel load to build up. But there's a lot of people who say, no, we need more trees, and so they fight it. I know there's eucalyptus that when they catch fire, they explode and the embers spread the fire a lot more easily. And so people say, let's get rid of the eucalyptus. Well, there's a Save the Eucalyptus group. So it's the political solutions, and there's environmentalists fighting environmentalists on this. So it's not an easy subject to deal with. You know, if we could make it more scientific, hopefully it'll be better. And I think as people start losing their homes, they realize the best thing we have to do is kind of create defensible spaces. We have to think that fire is natural, especially in the West. You talk to people in the East, where it's wet all the time, fire is not an issue. It's out here in the West where we're dry because of the natural dry climate. We get a drought every summer. And here I just wanted to push one thing here. And the reason I want to push landscapes with, you have to think about landscape changes as causing different temperature changes. You can't just average it all together. And I don't think I told this joke yet, but I like to tell a joke about how you can abuse an average temperature. And there was this man cleaning his oven. And he reaches deep inside the oven and he gets his head caught in the back, and then trying to free himself, he turns the oven on and knocks the knob off. So now he's getting hot. Now he kicks his feet trying to flail and get some leverage, and he gets his foot caught in the freezer. So he starts screaming. He's cold in one place, burning in another place. His wife calls the doctor. The doctor takes all these measurements and said, there's no problem. His body temperature is perfectly average.
His average temperature is fine.
So, and the point of that is you can obscure a lot of things that are happening when you use the average. So this crisis graph is an average, which is really a chimera of many different things. What I use here on this is data from Berkeley's Earth surface temperature data. 35% of the weather stations that they use to put this average together are sort of like the man's feet in the freezer. They show a cooling trend for the last 70 years. And you average that together with other places that are warming, and now you get this rise in temperature, but you can't say the places that are cooling don't have a warming crisis. So what is going on? And partly seeing that is what moved me, because the work I did in the Sierra, the maximum temperatures were higher in the 30s than they were now.
You know, I've always wondered how you can get an accurate global temperature when you have such finite instruments all over the globe.
And that's exactly the problem. I'm saying the average, and partly as an ecologist, what you realize is it might be good to think globally, but every organism reacts locally. I don't have a bear in the Sierras worrying about ice in the Arctic or a drought in the Sahara. You have to look at regional temperatures. You have to break it down.
So that brings another topic. Are there polar bears that are worried about this?
Well, I was going to say that a little bit later if I could finish this first, but the polar bears are doing better than ever. But if you look at this, you see the blue spots here in this. Those are all the places. So the southeast of the United States has been cooling for 100 years, and there's a number of papers talking about a warming hole. How come this part of the United States isn't warming? Now, here's from Yosemite, is showing the maximum temperatures were warmer in the 30s. There's another data set, instead of looking at weather stations, we look at tree rings. And if we want to put the climate change that we're experiencing now into the proper context, you got to go beyond what our instrumental data are telling us. And we really only have good instrumental data back 150 years. And that's mostly the United States and Western Europe. Most of the data from the globe has only been started since the 50s. So we look at tree rings. And the tree ring scientists, and they've been working hard at this, because the tree ring data does not say there's a crisis. If you look at this data here, you'll see in the 30s there was a peak, so we see this warming, and we think before the 30s there was not enough CO2 to cause a warming, so we think this 30s warming was natural. And then it cooled.
Oh, wait, so the 30s warming was caused by an increase in CO2?
No.
No.
We're saying we
So
think
it
it's
was
a
a
natural.
natural
So it
increase.
could have
Okay.
been that Pacific Decadal Oscillation. It could have been a change in the way heat is transported. And so if you watch the weather sometimes, you see this wavy jet wave. And so warm air will be brought up into the western United States and we'll have record heat. And then it dips down and it brings cold air from the Arctic. And so you have record cold in Minnesota and Illinois or whatever. So a lot of the way the weather and the temperatures change is the way heat gets transported, how much gets transported from the tropics towards the poles. And these oscillations cause this kind of change in air circulation. If you look at the tree rings, they don't show any of the temperatures warmer now than they were in the 30s and the 40s. And so that, I tend to trust the trees more than I trust these politicos and all this other stuff that's going on. And it's partly why I've had, maybe CO2 will cause a crisis later on, but I don't see any evidence of a crisis right now.
Well, why does Dr. Gunther, for example, and other climate scientists say that the tree rings is evidence of global warming?
I don't know how I could say, if you look at this graph here, this is one of the latest ones put out. If you, what they've done is, sometimes they were just using tree ring widths, but they realized part of that width was governed by precipitation, others were governed by temperature, so they've got that far more defined so they can make it just temperature. And as much as they try, they haven't been able to get the last 30 years to match the instrumental data. So the tree rings here, you can say since 1900 to 1930, there was a definite warming. Between the 40s and 50s down to the 70s, there was a definite cooling. Since the 70s, there's been a warming. So if he's making the argument, his argument could be, yes, we see a warming, but that warming isn't any worse than what it was in the 30s. It's not like that crisis graph making it go straight up.
Right.
And partly what I mentioned here is when they've looked at this data, some of the climate scientists would say, we got this blip, this warm blip in the 30s and 40s, how do we get rid of it? Instead of saying, what are we missing or what's temperature missing, they're saying it's not fitting our theory on CO2, so let's find a way to change it.
Change the model rather
change the model, or change the data instead of change the model, which to me sets off all the red flags. It's if the data, if the models don't fit the data, then you got to make a better model.
Jim, you know they deny that they would do that.
Well, but they've said it. We got it in writing that they've said, and they've actually done that. If you look at the crisis graph, you don't see it match the way the tree rings are.
Yeah.
So,
for a guy like me who doesn't know anything, it's just really hard to hear this stuff.
Well, and that's partly why people don't want. I mean, once you believe something, you don't want to let it go. And I think whether you're a skeptic or an alarmist, whatever branch of science you're in, you make a hypothesis, and then you make sure you try to do everything you can to prove your hypothesis is right. And even though you might get a few pieces of data that are contradictory, you say, well, maybe it's because of X and Y or Z or whatever. But you really need to be proven wrong.
The best scientists enjoy being proven wrong.
Well, that's it. And there's
I forget where I learned that.
There's a famous physicist said it's our duty as good scientists to bend over backwards and prove ourselves wrong.
Yeah.
And when I look at data, when I wrote this book and when I write these columns every 2 weeks, I read 100 different papers. And I read them from all different sides trying to figure out what's going on. And a lot of times, the crisis is just a narrative. It's not supported by the data. And hopefully we get to a place where we have stronger science. But I'd say, well, why would someone push this warming? Well, one reason is that you can look at this urban heat effect. When we've covered over the natural vegetation, we're causing the temperature to rise. And if most of our weather stations are from places that have been affected by this urban heat effect, that's going to give a stronger rise in temperature than places like the trees that are being measured in places it's natural habitat. So I think you have, what we really are seeing is instrumental data is measuring urban effects, and the tree rings are measuring natural effects. And at least for nature, I don't see a crisis.
Yeah.
So,
so we only have just a few more minutes. I would like you to talk about the polar bears.
Okay.
I think you talked about walruses or something.
I did that. But just one last thing on instrumental data.
Okay.
Because of this urban heat effect, and because most of the weather stations were not designed to measure climate, in 2004, the climate scientists put together a number of stations specifically to look at climate change. And this is the graph, is the result of that. And what you see is these oscillating temperatures. El Niños, La Niñas do that, but you don't see a warming trend. So again, if I'm looking at tree rings, I'm looking at the most state-of-the-art temperature weather stations geared to understanding climate. This crisis idea is being way overblown. So now I'll switch. Oh, I just one last thing. Here's an EPA saying heat waves are worse. This is the EPA's heat wave index. We see the EPA, so it's not a skeptical organization, but this is put out, it's the 30s for the biggest heat wave. And other than that, we don't have a trend in heat waves.
Oh.
So now we shoot out to, all right. So again, this is the idea of this climate crisis. National Geographic sent out a photographer, and he's got a number looking for dead bears or looking for sick bears. And then they put it online, and millions of people saw this, and they said, oh, this is climate change. This is what it's doing to the polar bears. They don't show you all the healthy bears. But if you know it as an ecologist, the studies in the Arctic have shown that when we've had less ice the last 20 years, there's been a 30% increase in productivity, meaning more plankton are photosynthesizing. They're providing more food for fish. More fish means more seals means more bears. And every prediction about polar bears suffering, and sometimes they'll go up and down, a lot of times it's due to hunting, but actually a number of studies show if you have too much ice, if the wind blows all this ice up against the coast, the seals can't get free soon enough, and they start starving a little bit, and they don't breed the next year. And that makes it tougher on the polar bears. So actually too much ice in the spring has been a bigger issue than too little ice, because too little ice allows more productivity, and that goes all the way through the food web. And so then you see pictures like this, and that doesn't get the same height, where it's a flock of polar bears. And almost all the data, none of the data shows the amount of polar bears going down, it shows the polar bears are going up. So again, this idea of a crisis and it's killing polar bears isn't being justified by the observations. They've done the same thing with penguins. They said emperor penguins were going extinct, and I studied these because they use bands to capture them and mark them and see if they survive or not. And I've done the same studies with my birds, and they did very bad methodology. But what we do know with the emperor penguins, their numbers have been increasing. Now it could be increasing because we're finding more. It could be increasing because climate change is actually helping them. We're not quite sure on emperors yet, but they're certainly not going down. But if you, this was a study that was done that made people fear the penguins were going to die, is this one place where they were banding the birds, they caused the emperor penguins to leave that colony because they were being disturbed. And someone put this picture up, David Ainley, he has it on Penguin Science. He had an arrow saying temperatures going up, population going down, here's how climate change is killing penguins. Well, it was fake news. Here's the whoops. This is a picture, I put it in my book. The arrow is what he was claiming was happening. I broke up the different temperatures during different times of the penguins' breeding season, and there's no change in temperature at all for the emperor penguins. And this is British Antarctic Survey data. So again, it was sort of, people are kind of caught up in Berlin, and David Ainley is a good scientist. I know he does a lot of work with seabirds and a few other things. He just kind of caught up in this idea that climate change is causing these problems. And it was some of his papers that were saying that the penguins would go extinct due to climate change. He pushed this with the other Antarctic penguin is the Adelies. And we do know, because the Adelies, the emperors breed on the ice in the winter, so it's hard to get good data on them. But the Adelies wait till the ice is melted a little, and we know they've gone from 5 million to 8 million.
We do have to break.
All right.
I so much appreciate that you came on with all this information the amazing thing, we can all agree that there are a lot of different problems, and I think the disagreement is that it's not just one thing that's causing all of the problems. That's at least what your point of view is.
You need a good analysis to get a good remedy.
From my perspective, and actually from Dr. Gunther's perspective, that what we really need is more conversation, and we need more discussion where we don't get caught up in the narrative of the day. That we can really have a real conversation without the alarm bells. Let's turn the alarm bells off and let's have a conversation and figure out what we can do about saving the forest, saving the animals, saving animals from extinctions. There's a lot of things that are going on that we have some control over.
Absolutely.
And so I really appreciate you spending the time and making this presentation. It's been very
well, thank you for having me, John.
It's been delightful.
All right.
Thank you so much. Okay. And thank you for joining us. Come back. We'll have more. We'll have other guests talking on this topic, and who knows, maybe we'll get Jim Steele back. This has been fun. Thank you.